My name is Bolaji, Ayodeji. So, today we will be looking at version control with Git and GitHub. And kind of like what we want to do is run through how this is the foundation of open source generally. I mean, when we're talking about open source, everything happens, we are collaborating, right? And this is the only reason why we can collaborate. And that's kind of like what we run through today. We start with the foundations, the fundamentals, and then work our way through what you would most likely be using every day. Version control basically is the process of tracking and managing changes to software code or except files over time. And that's just pretty much it. The emphasis here is on tracking and managing. You're trying to track and you're trying to manage what you're tracking. And the essence why we are doing this is because, like I mentioned earlier, you're collaborating with a lot of people, right? I usually make this joke that you will not be collaborating with someone in Lagos and, let's say I'm in Abuja in Lagos, and then when I, contribute to a code, I send you a flash drive to Abuja, you do yours, you send the flash drive back to me, and we keep doing that, right? So there needs to be an efficient way for us to do this. And that's pretty much everything around version control, right? So we all know what version control is now, and then there's something called the version control software, which is pretty much the application that keeps track of what we just mentioned now. Every single modification you make to a piece of code is, stored in this special kind of database. And the idea is that if any mistake is made, you can restore the previous versions, you can check the previous versions, and it just helps you in minimizing disruption to collaboration and everything. So just pretty much take note of the word version, which I think we are all familiar with, version 1, version 2, version 3. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a version in the concept of, let's say, a release. So generally we have like 3 kinds of version control systems. But then the major kinds of, version control systems we have is the centralized version control system and the distributed version control system. So, to make this very easy to understand, as we can see here, this is like one person's computer, this is another person's computer, this is another person's computer. I think that's the same thing there, so you can just look at that one because I'm explaining the centralized one. And then in the middle, we have the central repository. Now, the repository is pretty much just the storage. I mentioned something about the database, it's just a storage where you store code. And that lives on the server, it lives online, it's not on your computer. So we have 4 people, is that 4? Yeah, 4 people trying to contribute to a code that lives here, right? The idea is that this person is making changes to the server, which is usually called a commit, and then, getting code back and checking out and doing all of that stuff to that central repository now. So, for you to understand why there's a difference between centralized and distributed, I will now try and explain this. In the case of a distributed version control system, there are 2 copies of the code. One lives on the origin and the other one lives on the local computer. So, the idea is when you get this code, you have a copy on your local computer. So before you communicate to this, you communicate to that copy first. Does it make sense? So how it works here is that every single communication is straight to the server. So we are 4 working on a particular code base. Whatever changes I make is going straight to the server. And that means you are literally making connections with the internet every single time. But with this kind of setup, it's more like saying you have the ability to make all your changes locally on your own local copy, which is usually called the remote. We'll get to that. And then when you are done, that is when you now send your updates to the the central repository. Yeah, so we have some types of VCS, like I mentioned. These are the older ones. They existed way before Git, and this was what we were using before we had the distributed version control systems. There are more, but then I just brought out this because you really would not need to worry about that. Like I mentioned earlier, there are several benefits of using version control system. The first one is for you to have a code backup. This backup is not just about having the entire code base, it's about having several versions of that code base, several changes you made over time. And yeah, I think we'll understand that better when we start talking more about Git and GitHub more. But then the second benefit is that it allows you to be more efficient and agile in your process. I think I made a comment earlier. I thought it was a joke, but nobody laughed. So I'll probably try and mention it again. Imagine you're working together with a lot of people, and and then you have to literally send flash drives from Lagos to Abuja for every single change you made because you don't have version control. Thank you. So that's kind of like the whole process. It fosters agile in teams, and then allows you to manage your source code much more better. I mean, if we've all been using Git like you all say you are, or some of you say you are, you can begin to picture how you're able to manage your code more in terms of making errors, collaborating with people, and all of that stuff, which also brings us to the next point of traceability. You're able to trace what went wrong at this particular point. And we've all been writing code at some point, and then, like 2 minutes ago it was working, and you just added a comma somewhere, and then everything stopped working, and you really do not know what's happening, right? So with version control, if you are using it effectively, because some of us just write code for like 5 hours and then commit, write for another 5 hours and commit. So if you're trying to, if you have that kind of system, probably you will not be able to trace anything because within that 5 hours, you just like you have made so many changes. But you're able to trace what could have gone wrong before, after, and all of that stuff. Then I mentioned branch and merge conflict earlier. And the next thing is reverting changes, like I mentioned earlier. You can make some changes where you made some errors, and you can always go back to previous versions, even down to 10 years ago. You've started versioning your code since then. And that's really, really efficient and very helpful. And I mean, the main benefit here is that it allows you to effectively collaborate with people. So yeah, version control is an essential part of everyday code and software engineering practices. And it's supposed to be like a foundation to everything. So this is the main focus of today, Git, right? I mentioned there several times, but we'll be talking about Git. So Git is like the most widely used version control system today. It's distributed and it was developed by Linus Torvalds, the famous creator of Linux, the previous workshop that was talking about Linus, and also the same person created Git. And you can imagine why he had to do that. Because, I mean, Linux is a big project, so imagine there were so many issues then, so he had to find a way, right? And the summary is that Git is free and it's an open source distributed version control system. So if anybody asks what is Git, Git is a free and open source distributed version control system. Okay? So we are getting closer to the hands-on part, which is literally version controlling with Git. So let's just walk through the entire idea behind Git, right? And all of this happens on your computer, right? So you have a working directory. Now let's assume you're trying to contribute to open source, that's the idea, right? And you cloned, you understand that term, right? Okay, thank you. We've cloned the code and you have it in your working directory, right? So when you make a change, you're adding it to something called the index. It's like the staging area. Are we familiar with the word staging? It's a popular term in software engineering where there's an intermediary between the production and then development. So before you get to it, before your code is now in production, when I say production, I mean being used by actual users, it goes to the staging first. Usually a lot of things happen there, testing and all that stuff, but that's the idea. And that's the same thing that is going on here. Before you add, so you make one change, it goes to the index and it stays there. When you commit that change, it goes to the head. Now, the head is like storing pieces of commits because remember, all of this is still a local process. When you're done, you want to move it to the central repository. So when I make one change, let's say I add an authentication feature, I add, and then I commit it. It stays in the head. When I make another change, I add one more feature, I add, and I commit, it stays in the head. It keeps staying here. Remember what we said about distributed version control system? It allows you to have a local commit here. If we're dealing with a centralized version control system, when you add and you do this, it's going straight to central repository. And you keep filing different versions until you're ready to like push. So basically, GitHub is like a hosting service. Just like how you build online, you want to deploy your website, you have to build your domain and a hosting space. Or you set up your own local server. Now, GitHub doesn't only host code. That's one of the benefits. It comes with some other features that make software engineering interesting. Right? So there are several features. First is the repository where we store the code. You have like an interface where you can see all those changes you're making on your terminal, right? Sometimes it might be hard for you to like go through the sample and everything. Because usually, the other thing I forgot to mention is each of those changes you're making sometimes are also called snapshots. It's not like saying a picture of what's happening here and this point and this point and this point. All of them have references, right? So if you are not really like a terminal kind of person, like you have to like go through check this reference, check that kind of stuff. So GitHub kind of like an example that I use. It just gives you an interface for most of these things you do on the terminal, right? And you get tags, for your repositories, you can do tagging, pull requests, the branch we mentioned that you do. So everything on GitHub is built with, it's built on Git, but then it like has some flavors to make it easier to work with, right? And then you also get like, there are new cool features like code spaces. Do we know code spaces? Yes. Okay, it's a new feature where you can take an entire repository from GitHub and then run like an ID online, which is called code spaces. So if you use VS Code Atom and all that, you run your code online, right? So imagine you want to contribute to an open source project. You don't have to like bring the code to your local computer. You can run it on your browser, code spaces. So you can imagine all of those evolving features that will come in. And then we also have stuff like issues, just like it sounds. You create an issue on the repository. It might not really make so much sense, but like this is just what they are doing behind now. Add more features for things to collaborate. You also have pull requests. So we already understand branching and merging is. So when you want to merge, sometimes you don't just merge because you might have an accident with something. So you have to like send a signal that I'm trying to merge something. So everybody knows that the merge is happening and then it's that's just the idea behind the pull request. Like, oh, I want to pull. It sounds weird because pull should mean you're trying to take something. But pull request actually mean you're trying to send something. So anyway, I don't know how those things are done. But then the other features like discussions, releases, like the stuff I mentioned, the Linux games. When those changes are made, when you have different versions, sometimes they're called as releases. On that online repository, you can see a particular release that includes a bunch of changes for different times, and you can go back in time, and you can move forward in time. And then you also have stuff like a project board. We are mostly used to what's it called? Jira and all of that stuff. How many of us know Jira? If you know Jira, you're a beginner. If you just raise our hands up now. And then the other stuff like organizations and things and all of that. So, all of these things you can find when you go to GitHub.com. If you have an account, you already know them. If you don't have an account, create one and you can explore these things. When you create a GitHub account, also, I didn't mention that it's also an essential thing to have as a software engineer or any kind of developer that you have, because GitHub serves like a resume for developers pretty much, because you can post all of the projects there. GitHub also has a nice feature now where you can create like, I think I have a screenshot of that here, right? Yeah. You can do something like this, like a bio and all of that stuff, or like a resume short one in your repository. This is what someone will see first, before you see your different repositories and bunch of other stuff. So you can always do that. So create your account and then you have all of this. And then now you have GitHub account, you have Git. You need to connect both of them together. You can't just go randomly. So you can configure that with Git. Git config blah blah blah, you add your username. Git config blah blah blah. And then this is just pretty much it. It's self-explanatory. So we don't really have so much time to talk about branching, but we pretty much explained this already, right? So that's just how branch works. We have one straight line, which is the major, the default, right? And then you have several features, and then you can merge them at this point where the joiner continue the journey. And that's pretty much everything. I think I have a couple of resources that we should all check out. By now we all know this already now. So what next? I have a couple of resources. I will share a link to this slide where you can like learn this at your own pace.